January 31st, 1945, Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank T. McCoy's hands trembled as he stood before an intact Mitsubishi G-Fam Betty bomber. Tail number 763-12. What he was about to discover would revolutionize American understanding of Japanese aviation and expose one of the most shocking design decisions in military history. The bomber gleamed in the tropical sun nearly 20 meters from nose to tail, with wings spanning 25 meters. This wasn't a crashed aircraft salvaged from wreckage. This was a complete operational bomber abandoned by its crew during the American advance. But when McCoy climbed inside and opened the wing inspection panels, he froze. The fuel tanks were completely unprotected. No self-sealing rubber compound, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, just thin aluminum skin, perhaps 2 millimeters thick, separating thousands of liters of high-octane aviation fuel from enemy machine gun fire. This cannot be their standard design, McCoy muttered to his team. No Air Force would build bombers this way, but they had. And the story of why would reveal a design philosophy so alien to Western military thinking that it would take months for analysts to fully comprehend. To understand this shocking discovery, we need to go back 4 years earlier to December 8, 1941. That morning, as smoke still rose from Pearl Harbor, 80 Betty bombers lifted off from bases on Formosa, modern-day Taiwan. Their target, Clark Field itself, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The attack achieved complete surprise. Arriving at 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese formation flew at 20,000 feet beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. In 45 minutes, American air power in the Philippines was effectively eliminated. Of 17 B-17 flying fortresses on the ground, 12 were destroyed. Nearly every P-40 Warhawk fighter was reduced to burning wreckage. Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as the Japanese withdrew. What struck me was how they came in, he later wrote. Perfect formation, high altitude, totally beyond our reach. We couldn't get a single plane airborne. The Betty bombers had struck from bases 460 miles away at feet. No American bomber could match at that stage of the war. 2 days later, the Betty would achieve something even more remarkable. December 10, 1941, 26 Betty bombers joined older Japanese bombers in attacking Force a British naval task force built around the battleship HMS Prince of Wales and the battle cruiser HMS Repulse. The Bettys carried Type 91 aerial torpedoes, each weighing 840 kilograms. The attack began at 12:20 in the afternoon. Japanese bombers approached in coordinated waves, their torpedo runs executed with precision that stunned British observers. Prince of Wales took at least 6 torpedo hits. Repulse absorbed 4. Both capital ships capsized and sank within hours. 841 British sailors died. For the first time in naval history, capital ships actively defending themselves had been sunk solely by air power in the open sea. British naval superiority in Asian waters had been shattered in 90 minutes. Through early 1942, Betty bombers seemed unstoppable. They hit Darwin, Australia from bases 1,500 miles away. They struck Port Moresby from airfields across New Guinea's mountain ranges. They attacked Guadalcanal from Rabaul, a distance exceeding 600 miles. The Betty's operational range gave Japanese forces strategic flexibility that Allied commanders struggled to counter. It became the symbol of Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness. But this advantage depended entirely on one condition: limited Allied fighter opposition. By mid-1942, everything changed. August 8, 1942, 23 Betty bombers departed Rabaul to attack American positions at Guadalcanal. American fighters intercepted the formation over Tsavo Island. 18 of the 23 bombers were shot down. Approximately 120 aviators died. Fighter pilots reported the same observation across every engagement. The Betty exploded into flames with minimal hits. 2 or 3 rounds anywhere along the fuselage or wings produced catastrophic results. The aircraft earned grim nicknames that spread through American squadrons: Flying Cigar, One Shot, Lighter Flying, Zippo, all references to the Betty's terrifying tendency to bloom into fire from battle damage. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, who arrived at Guadalcanal commanding Corsair fighters in October 1942, later reported, "First time we caught a Betty formation. We couldn't believe how easy they went down. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings and they'd explode. We actively hunted them." The Betty had transformed from feared predator to preferred prey in less than a year. But why? What made these bombers so catastrophically vulnerable? The first clues came in November 1942, when Australian forces overran Japanese airfields at Buna in Papua New Guinea. Among the abandoned aircraft, intelligence units discovered Betty bombers with varying levels of damage. Engineers examined the wing access panels and confirmed what pilots had reported. The fuel tanks had no protection whatsoever. This wasn't battle damage or field modification. This was standard Japanese design. The implications were staggering. By 1942, American bombers universally featured self-sealing fuel tanks. The B-17 Flying Fortress had them. The B-24 Liberator had them. Even fighter aircraft like the P-38 and P-47 had protected fuel systems. Self-sealing fuel tanks used layered rubber compounds that swelled when punctured, sealing holes and preventing fuel loss and fire. The technology added substantial weight, but dramatically improved crew survival rates. American military doctrine considered this weight penalty essential and non-negotiable. Yet here was Japan's primary land-based bomber, produced in thousands and operating across the entire Pacific theater, with fuel tanks that offered zero protection. The captured Betty at Clark Field in January 1945 would provide the most complete analysis. Major McCoy and his team spent 3 weeks dismantling and documenting every system. The specifications told a story of ruthless optimization. Empty weight: 6,741 kilograms, remarkably light for a bomber of its size. Maximum takeoff weight: 9,500 kilograms. Fuel capacity: 4,780 liters, distributed across -1 unprotected tanks positioned in the wings where they were most vulnerable to combat damage. The performance numbers were impressive. Top speed of 428 kilometers per hour. Maximum range exceeding 3,700 miles. Service ceiling of 8,500 meters. But the fuel system design was a death trap. The 8 tanks were arranged in the wing center section where it joined the fuselage. This placement maximized fuel capacity, but it also positioned the tanks directly in the path of enemy fire. Any attack from the side or below would inevitably strike fuel tanks. American engineers calculated that the weight saved by eliminating protection systems exceeded 500 kilograms per aircraft. This translated directly into additional fuel capacity and extended range. But combat reports showed that Betty bombers hid anywhere in the wing area exploded with near certainty. Engineers termed this a critical failure point, the single system whose destruction guaranteed loss of the entire aircraft. These numbers told the story of design choices made in September 1937 when the Japanese Navy issued requirements that would define the G4N's entire existence. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, cruising altitude of 3,000 meters, range of 4,720 kilometers unloaded, or 3,700 kilometers, carrying 800 kilograms of bombs or torpedoes. The requirements reflected Japanese naval strategy. In the late 1930s, Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed bombers capable of striking enemy positions far beyond the range of carrier aircraft, bombers that could operate from land bases to support naval operations across the entire theater. Existing Japanese bombers fell far short of these requirements. The G3N bomber, then in service, had a maximum range of approximately 3,000 kilometers. American bombers like the B-17 had even more limited range in their early variants. No bomber in service anywhere in the world in 1937 could strike targets at the distances Japanese planners envisioned. The requirements were not arbitrary. They were calculated based on the distances Japanese forces would need to cover in any future Pacific conflict, from Formosa to the Philippines, 460 miles from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 600 miles from Japanese home islands to potential targets across the Pacific, thousands of miles. But the requirements also reflected assumptions about future warfare that would prove catastrophically wrong. Japanese planners assumed that surprise and initiative would provide protection for long-range bombers. They assumed that enemy fighter opposition would be limited by range and numbers. They assumed that the war would be decided quickly before enemy industrial capacity could generate overwhelming force. Every assumption would prove false. The man tasked with achieving the impossible was Kiro Honjo, who led the Mitsubishi design team. Honjo had studied bomber design at Junkers in Germany during the early 1930s before returning to Japan. He understood immediately that meeting the Navy's requirements would demand compromises that Western air forces would never accept. Honjo assembled a team of engineers at Mitsubishi's Nagoya facilities to tackle the design challenges. The mathematics were brutally simple. To achieve the required range, the aircraft needed massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed approximately 0.8 kilograms. 4,780 liters of fuel meant approximately 3,800 kilograms of fuel weight at full load. To achieve the required speed with this fuel load, the aircraft needed minimal weight. Every kilogram added to the empty weight reduced either range or payload capacity. These two requirements existed in direct opposition. Fuel was heavy. Protection systems were heavy. Armor plating would add hundreds of kilograms. Self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through the rubber compounds and additional structure required. Fire suppression systems added weight. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would prevent achieving the required performance. Honjo made the decision that would define the G for M throughout its service life. Protection would be sacrificed for performance. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds. No armor plating around fuel cells. No fire suppression systems beyond basic fire extinguishers. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel capacity, range, and achieving the Navy's performance specifications. The decision was not made lightly. Honjo understood the risks. His team calculated the vulnerabilities that unprotected fuel tanks would create. They knew that combat damage to the wings would likely prove catastrophic, but they also knew that the Navy's requirements could not be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between an aircraft that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or an aircraft that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Honjo delivered performance. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. The aircraft met every performance requirement the Navy had specified. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Initial production models began reaching operational units in April 1941. By December 1941, approximately 180 G4Ms were in service with the Japanese Navy. The Betty's combat debut at Clark Field and against 4C demonstrated the wisdom of Honjo's design priorities in the Pacific. -1 of early 1942, when facing limited opposition, when achieving surprise, when operating beyond the range of enemy fighters, the Betty was devastatingly effective. But these advantages depended entirely on the assumption that Betty formations would face minimal opposition. The moment American fighter strength increased, the moment interception became routine, the moment sustained combat became inevitable, every design choice that prioritized range over protection became a death sentence for crews.